So welcome everybody to this Women's Budget Group Winter Webinar. This is one of a series of events that we've been organising, often with a COVID theme, to look at different issues in women's lives and how COVID has affected them. The session today is focusing about women's paid and unpaid work. And there's a really important reason why we wanted to look at those two things together. And that's because we believe at the Women's Budget Group that the inequality in unpaid work is at the heart of the inequality that women face in the labour market. We know that women do about 60% more unpaid work than men in pre-COVID times. And this reduces the amount of time that women have for paid work, which means that women work fewer hours, earn less, and as a result own less and are more likely to be poor. And you can see this playing out throughout the life course. So by the time we get to retirement, if you look at private pension wealth, the average private pension wealth of a woman is about 10% of the average private pension wealth of a man. And that is about inequalities over a life course playing out towards the end of life. We also know that women are in a disadvantaged position in the labour market, even pre-COVID, more likely to be in part-time work, which tends to be paid less well than full-time work, more likely to be on 0 hours contracts, more likely to be in involuntary part-time work, and the majority of those who are not entitled to statutory sick pay, which obviously is a significant issue at the moment in a time of global pandemic. So what we've seen, as we will hear from the speakers during this session, is an exacerbation of many of those equalities as a result of COVID. Although men have done more unpaid work than ever before as a result of the pandemic, women are still doing the lion's share and continuing to do the lion's share as we are in the, moved out of phase 1 of lockdown and into whatever this second phase is. So we're really lucky to have with us today an absolutely brilliant panel of speakers. We've got 2 double acts and a speaker speaking by themselves. So first up, we have Professor Tracey Warren and Professor Clare Lyonette. Tracey's from Nottingham University Business School, and Professor Clare Lyonette from the Warwick Institute for Employment Research. And they're going to be speaking about the research that they've been doing specifically on working class women. We're then going to hear from Alison Andrew, Senior Research Economist from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who have done some really important work on looking at how childcare is shared within heterosexual couples with children. And then we have Professor Anne McMunn and Dr. Baowen Xue, from the ESRC International Centre for LifeCourse Studies at University College London. So each group of panelists is going to speak for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion. If you'd like to take part in the discussion on the chat, you can do so. Anna from the Women's Budget Group is posting links to various materials that people are coming up with. You may want to post links as well. If you have a question for the panelists, please post it in the Q&A box, because in the chat things can get lost as conversation goes on between conversation and actual questions. So if you put them in the Q&A box, we will do that at the end. So first off, I would like to hand over to Tracey and Clare, who are going to be talking about the impact of the pandemic on paid and unpaid work among working class women. Over to you.
Tracey, are you going to put the slides on? Brilliant. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Mary-Ann. I'm just going to start briefly, and then I'm going to pass over to Tracey just to give an overview of our recent findings. In terms of the division of domestic labour, gender, we know that the division of domestic labour is very resistant to any large change, and that includes even in times of previous crises, for example, previous recessions, male job loss, redundancy, etc. In terms of housework, women tend to do the regular, the routine, the dirty tasks. So we're talking things like washing and ironing, cleaning. Men are more likely to do the non-regular tasks such as DIY and gardening. And there's also some evidence that men are more likely to share the visible tasks such as grocery, shopping and cooking rather than those hidden tasks. But women are still more likely than men to do the most. Men are also more likely to share childcare than to share housework over more recent years, with a new focus on good fathering, etc. In terms of class, there's limited work on class differences in housework and childcare, but it's not straightforward. So some research shows that middle-class men are more likely to share housework, especially if the female partner's also working. Others show that working class men perhaps have more traditional attitudes overall, but are actually more likely to pick up the slack in terms of housework and childcare if the female partner is working. And just bear in mind that middle class couples are much more likely to have a cleaner than working class couples, and also that working class couples are more likely to do shift parenting where one partner works while the other one is at home, for example. There's also some differences in housework among men by ethnicity as well, but we're not going to go into that here. So overall, just to sort of summing up, the picture so far is one of stalled progress, with working women in couples still doing a disproportionate amount of housework and childcare before the pandemic hit. So this is what we're talking about today, but just to point out that Tracey and I are doing other stuff on this project as well. The project is in collaboration with the Women's Budget Group, and we're analysing data from Understanding Society, which has been running since 2009. And it's a new study from Understanding Society, a COVID-19 study, which is a monthly survey of the experiences and reactions of the population to the COVID pandemic. So our research looks at employed women and men of working age. How did women fare overall compared with men, and to what extent were the working lives of employed women affected differently according to their class? So I'm going to pass over to Tracey to run through some of the findings.
Sorry, I'm just faffing. Okay, hi, yeah, so I'm just going to talk, can you hear me, Claire? Yeah, I'm going to just talk for a few minutes, and so really just going to give you some headline figures, headline results of an ongoing project, and there's more details on a project website which we can set links to you. So our first question, obviously, was who was doing the housework before and during the pandemic? And here on this figure 1 slide, we're interested in those routine housework tasks that Claire talked about. What we can see on figure 1 is what percentage of women in employment who were also in couples said it was always or usually them who did those kind of household tasks, washing and ironing, cleaning, cooking, etc. And what you can see, so that's the kind of blue columns, and what you can see before the pandemic. So in 2018, 2019, the majority of the women in our survey said that they did those tasks, with those dirty house work tasks Claire mentioned standing out, washing and ironing, cleaning. And this pattern intensified after the pandemic across all those tasks apart from grocery shopping. So just an example, in June 2020, that dark blue column, you could see about 70% of employed women in couples said they were always or mostly doing the washing and ironing, 61% were doing the cleaning. And one of the questions we're interested in is how much time people were spending in the housework. And in June again, almost half of women, those employed women, were doing 11 hours or more a week. And far fewer men, when they were asked the same question, reported doing quite as much housework. And if we're interested in that class picture and who's doing housework, well, you can see the women in semi-routine and routine jobs, and women who were small employers and self-employed were doing the most hours a week. So 19% and 23% of them were saying that they were doing 21 hours or more. And that compared with far fewer percentages of women in management professional jobs, for example. So if you look at this group here, the management and professional and the intermediate, about 60% said they were doing maximum 10 hours a week. So we're powering through this, so we ain't got time to be showing all of our results, but We also show that women reported having the main responsibility for childcare, and this increased after the pandemic. Women also reported doing more of the homeschooling than the men. So, given these extra pressures on women, one question we're interested in is who had access to kind of flexible working arrangements in the workplace to kind of help them manage these pressures. And what we see here is a strongly classed picture and who had access to some of the better quality arrangements. So, for example, being able to vary your work hours, be able to work from home, bit of flexi time. And middle class women were doing far better than working class women in terms of this. So fewer working class women had access to kind of decent flexible working arrangements, and also very few working class men too. So what about that question about working from home? Because we know there's an awful lot of interest in the impact of the pandemic, not just on how many hours, but the location of our paid work. And our research has shown a big increase in who was working from home for employed women and men both. So just as an example here, we were interested, I mean, there's other ways we look at this, but this is just who was always working from home. And this is January, February 2020, and then June 2020. And you see a real interesting class picture there, a very strong class picture, so much so that only 9% of those women in routine and semi-routine jobs were always working from home after the pandemic. Compare that with almost half, so 44% of the women in management and professional jobs, and actually very similar, slightly higher percentage of men in similar jobs were working from home. So finally, we also were interested in who said they adapted their ways of working because of the time they spent on childcare or homeschooling. And so we can see that women were more likely than men to say that they reduced their hours because of the time they spent with childcare and homeschooling, and they were more likely than men to say they adapted their work schedules. But again, we've got a class telling a key story here. So very few working class women and very few working class men did either, reduce their hours or adapted their work schedule. So compare that with your management and professional women there, and also your men in management and professional jobs, where you've got big bunches of them able and actually adapting their work schedule. So I'm going to pass over to Claire just to sum up.
Thanks, Tracey. So just briefly, big gender differences maintained and actually grew during the pandemic. We've seen that working class women and self-employed women were doing more housework. Mothers far more likely to have main responsibility for childcare and homeschooling. But then that interesting class differences in terms of work adaptations and being able to be more flexible, but to take on those additional responsibilities of homeschooling, childcare, and working class women were the least likely to reduce hours or change their work schedules. And we would just say that, to manage that additional housework and childcare responsibilities, parents do need access to sympathetic employers and to good quality flexible working arrangements, and this doesn't seem to be the case for working class women and for working class men as well. Thank you. Oh, and if anyone's interested, please have a look at the briefing note too, which just came out today. So
excellent.
Thanks,
thank you very much for that. That was really this huge amount of data to absorb in that. So I think if you can put the link to the briefing notes that's up on your website in the chat, and we will share it as well. So I'm going to move straight on to Alice and Andrew from the IFS.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to share joint work with colleagues at the Institute for Physical Studies and the Institute of Education. And this presentation is particularly going to focus on parents and how mothers and fathers in heterosexual couples balanced paid work and domestic work during the first lockdown. So I want to start by thinking about some of the reasons why we might expect mothers and fathers to be impacted differently by COVID and the lockdown restrictions. So it might be the case that on average, mothers and fathers tend to do different types of jobs, different industries, different occupations, and they may be differentially exposed to the effects of the lockdown. And so going into the first lockdown, we know that women were overrepresented in the shutdown sectors. And so that would suggest that women might be more vulnerable to changes in their paid work during lockdown. But it's also the case that women were more likely to be key workers and were more likely to be able to work from home. So this paints a kind of a bit of a heterogeneous picture. We don't really know going kind of ex ante whether mothers and fathers are going to have been worse impacted. But then, and this is really kind of new for an economic crisis, we also have this huge kind of labour supply shock. The crisis has come hand in hand with a huge amount of new childcare and caring responsibilities, and we might have strong reasons to think that mothers would pick up the greater share of those new responsibilities. So in order to kind of get what the size of these effects were and what are the different channels through which they're operating, the IFS and the IOE ran a time use survey during the first lockdown. So this was a survey of 5,000 families with children in England. We collected information between the end of April and the middle of May. We re-weighted everything on kind of key demographic characteristics in order to try and make this as nationally representative as possible. And we focused on opposite gender two-parent households only for this survey because we really want to hone in on the gender difference. And at points, I'm going to compare our data to nationally representative data from a time use study in 2015. So if we dive in by looking at the gender gaps that have emerged during the first lockdown in who was working for pay. So the sample here is parents who used to be working for pay back in February. And then we look at the gaps that have emerged by April, May. And so the gap is defined as female minus male. So it's showing us that 10 percentage points more mothers than fathers were out of paid work in April and May of those that were working in February. And that this is coming in equal measure from 5 percentage points, being 5 percentage points more likely to have been laid off or have quit, and 5 percentage points more likely to have been on furlough, either by choice or at the request of the employer. So as we said, this might be coming from mothers' jobs being more vulnerable. It might also be coming from mothers taking on the bulk of the childcare. And so what we do to try and disentangle these two things is next to look at the differences between mothers and fathers who actually work in the same industries and the same occupations. So that should be taking out any kind of labour demand effects, and it just really honing in on the childcare, or what we might think of the labour supply side. When we do that, the differences actually increase. And so that's telling us that this is not a story about mothers' jobs on average being more vulnerable than fathers. Instead, this really looks like this is decision-making within the home, causing mothers' paid work to be prioritised less during the pandemic. So amongst those parents who stayed in work, the big falls in hours of work. So here I'm comparing back to 2014-15. Both mothers and fathers' hours of work have fallen, and proportionally mothers' hours of work have fallen by more. We also separate out interrupted work time and uninterrupted work time. Uninterrupted work time being time when the only activity reported in that hour is work. And we see that whilst in 2014, mothers and fathers seem to be interrupted at roughly the same rates, in 2020, mothers seem to be interrupted in half of their work hours compared to less than a third for fathers. And so we've seen this already. What's causing these changes to patterns of paid work it seems to be counteracting changes to patterns of domestic work. And so we see mothers doing more childcare and more housework than fathers. Here we're splitting childcare into childcare where the main activity is being with the child, and childcare which is more keeping an eye on the child. Mothers are doing more of each kind. You might think that differences in domestic work are being driven by the fact that mothers are working for pay at lower rates. That's not entirely what's going on. Even comparing mothers who are working for pay and fathers who are working for pay, and those who are not working for pay, mothers are always doing more housework and more childcare. It is the case that, as in the population overall, that in the majority of heterosexual couples, fathers earned more prior to the pandemic. So one could think that that couples are just prioritizing the work of the higher earner. This isn't really to do with gender. That's not what we see. Even in cases where the mother earned more prior to the pandemic, she's still doing more housework, more childcare, the same amount of housework, and then she's also doing a huge amount of paid work on top of that. We see big asymmetries. If we look at the set of parents where both parents were working for pay back in February, and then one of the parents has subsequently stopped during the first lockdown, the gender of the parent who stopped has a huge impact on how couples split things. So when the father has stopped working, we see that the mother takes on a huge amount of childcare and housework, which seems to allow the father to work long hours, the majority of which are uninterrupted work time. In the reverse situation, when only the mother is still working for pay, we see that the parents now split the childcare and the housework 50-50, but then on top of that, the mother is working 5 hours a day, working for pay 5 hours a day, of which almost half is interrupted. So overall, what we see is that mothers' participation in paid work and their hours of work have fallen by proportionally more than fathers. At the same time, mothers have been taking on a greater share of the childcare and the housework. And these patterns can't be accounted for by the industries and the occupations that mothers worked in or relative earnings prior to the pandemic. The split of domestic work can't be accounted for by which parents are working for pay. Mothers are always doing more. And so our work is suggesting that whose paid work is prioritized during difficult times, depending on far more than maximizing household income, that there's something special about gendered norms and habits and expectations that's having a first order effect here. What does this mean in the longer run? So we know from past research that short breaks from paid work and periods of part-time employment can have long-run scarring effects on women's career progression. This is particularly the case when women are trying to re-enter the labour force during an economic downturn, as is the case at the moment. So we ask our sample how pessimistic they are or optimistic they are about finding new employment. And we find that both mothers and fathers are fairly pessimistic about their prospects of finding a new job within a month. On average, mothers are more pessimistic than fathers. And so this is showing, I think this is the start of a story about the long run scarring effects. So they're going to challenge a lot of women coming back from the lockdown. On the other hand, a sort of bit of a silver lining, perhaps, fathers' involvement in day-to-day childcare has increased a lot as a result of the lockdown, despite still being nowhere near 50-50. And so it might be the case that this period of change could shift things over the longer run, both habits and norms within families, and also perhaps the norms and attitudes of employers who see their male employees having more family responsibilities. I think this is one of the biggest unknowns. It's really too early to say. And a final thing to end on is that we've seen a huge increase in the number of firms encouraging home working and accommodating flexible schedules and signalling that they're going to be doing that over the longer run. I think it's a really open question, the extent to which home working in particular is going to be good for mothers' careers. I think what our research shows is that when both parents are working from home, it really is difficult for mothers to protect their time in the same way, and longer run sort of transitions to home working are going to have to be managed very carefully for that to work for mothers. So I'm going to end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison. That was great. I'd read that report before, but actually seeing it set out like that so starkly, it really does hit you exactly, you know, what has been happening, and particularly the fact that this can't be explained by earning patterns, or, you know, who's doing paid work and who's not doing paid work. So our final presentation is from Anne McMunn and Baowen Xue from the Centre for LifeCourse Studies and Society at University College London. So I don't know which one of you is going first. Anne?
I believe it's me. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So yes, I'm Anne McMunn, and my colleague Baowen Xue and I are social epidemiologists at UCL. And we're presenting work we've been doing looking at gender divisions of unpaid care work and their association with psychological distress during the first lockdown in the UK. And I just want to start by defining what we mean when we're talking about unpaid care work. So we're using this term to refer to all of the services that are provided within the home on an unpaid basis. And here today, we're specifically looking at childcare and homeschooling and also housework. And we know that during the first lockdown, with the closure of schools and childcare facilities, that there was an increase in the workload associated with childcare and homeschooling, alongside parents, many parents working remotely from home, and along with all of these people at home together, an increase in housework as well. And we also know that there was a spike in psychological distress at the beginning of the first lockdown. So we wanted to look at, it's not letting me move my slides. It's not, the slides aren't moving on my screen. Are they moving?
No, they're not. It seems to be frozen.
Let me stop sharing and try again.
There's always some technical problem, isn't
there?
there?
Yeah, it had to be me. No, okay. Maybe this version. I just hope this is the right version. But there we go. Phew. Okay, sorry about that. So we wanted to look at how couples in the UK were dividing unpaid care work between them during the lockdown, some of what's been touched on today already, but then also to look at whether three different aspects of this were associated with changes in psychological distress. So first of all, simply whether the increase in unpaid care work was associated with increased psychological distress, but then looking at whether the gender divisions per se were associated with psychological distress, and also looking at whether the impact of increased unpaid care work on employment schedules was a particular source of stress for working parents during lockdown. We look at whether these associations are different for men and women, and also whether they differ depending on whether people are living with a partner or not. So like Claire and Tracey, we're using the Understanding Society data, or the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is a large national representative survey of 40,000 households that have been interviewed every year since 2009. And here we're using information that was collected during the pandemic in April and May specifically. And we're looking here at gender differences in unpaid care work. Women are the dotted bars and men are the solid bars. And so you can see that women were doing more during April and May than men. So women were doing on average 20 hours per week of childcare and homeschooling in April and 22 hours in May, compared with 12 hours on average for men in both April and May. Similarly, with housework, women were doing 15 hours per week on average in both April and May, compared with 10 hours for men. And also women, working mothers were more likely than working fathers to reduce their employment hours or adapt their work patterns in response to childcare and homeschooling. So 17% of working mothers reduced their employment hours in response to childcare and homeschooling, compared with 12% of working fathers. And well over a third of working mothers, 37% of working mothers, adapted their work patterns to accommodate childcare and homeschooling, compared with about 30% of working fathers. So we then wanted to go on and look at how these were associated with psychological distress. I'm just very briefly showing you here the measure that we use, so you know what we're talking about when we're talking about psychological distress. And an important point here is that we're actually looking at change in psychological distress, because we have measures from before the pandemic. So we're looking at change from pre-pandemic to psychological distress during lockdown. And what we find, first looking at men and women broadly, we find that for women, each additional hour that they spent in housework was associated with 0.5 point increase in the psychological distress scale in April, but not in May. And we didn't find this association for men. And when we look at parents in particular, we find that for mothers, each additional hour spent in childcare or homeschooling was associated with 0.5 point increase in psychological distress in both April and May. We find similar associations for fathers, but they didn't reach statistical significance. We think that's because we have fewer fathers in our sample, because we have both single mothers and partnered mothers in our sample. But the real take-home message here is that yes, there were associations, but these are weak associations. They're not strong associations. But then when we go on to look at the impact of increased childcare and homeschooling on work hours amongst working parents, in particular, we find stronger associations. So we find that for working parents, adapting work hours to accommodate childcare and homeschooling was associated with nearly 1.5 increased points for working mothers and over 1 point for working fathers in psychological distress. But when we drill down and look at how these associations differ depending on whether people are living with a partner or not, we find that actually for working mothers, this association is almost entirely concentrated amongst single mothers. And the association here is really very strong. So for single mothers who adapted their work hours to accommodate childcare and homeschooling, there was a nearly 4 point increase in their psychological distress during lockdown. Another great aspect of this data set is that we have information on all the members of the household, so we're able to actually look within couples and see how they are sharing or not sharing unpaid care work. And my colleague Baowen Xue will now share those results.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so in the second part of our study, we look at how men and women within couples divide the unpaid care work during lockdown. And as we show in the first graph, so women are in these dotted lines. So women shared about 63% of childcare or homeschooling. And also women's share of housework is the similar percentage, which is 63%. 64%, or in other words, so within couples, men only shared about 1/3 of childcare and 1/3 of housework. And in the second graph, we look at working parent couples to see how they juggled paid work with homeschooling and childcare during the lockdown. So we have 4 groups of people here. So the first group is neither partner reduced their employment hours to accommodate childcare or homeschooling. And second group are both partner reduced the employment hours. And third group is mother only. So mother is in the household is the mother who is the only person who reduced her work hours to accommodate childcare. And the final group is father only reduced the employment hours. And we found that it was more likely to be the mother rather than the father who reduced their employment hours to accommodate childcare. So the percentage was 22% mother only reduced and compared to 11% father only reduced. And in our data, we have a lot of families, so neither partner had reduced the employment hours. However, in our data, we have a lot more parents, they have adapted their work pattern to accommodate childcare. So again, it was more likely to be the mother rather than the father who adapt their work pattern to accommodate childcare. And the percentage was 32% mother only compared with 18% father only. And then we look into how the changes in work hours or work pattern have affect a couple's mental health. So we found that if only the father reduces his work hours or adapt his work pattern to accommodate childcare, then his psychological distress level is nearly 3 points higher compared with his counterparts where neither partner had to adapt or reduce their work hours to accommodate childcare. And if only the mother adapts her work pattern to accommodate childcare, and her psychological distress level is nearly 2 points higher compared with her counterparts where neither partner had to adapt work pattern. Okay, so here are the key points from our study. And first, we find that women continued to do more unpaid care work than men and were more likely to reduce or adjust their paid work hours to accommodate childcare during lockdown. Also, we find that trying to adapt work hours to accommodate childcare and homeschooling during lockdown was strongly associated with worsening mental health for lone mothers in particular. And within couples, we find that a sense of equity seems to be very important because the psychological distress level is particularly high if he or she was the only member in the household who adapts their work patterns. And also reducing work hours for childcare is associated with worsening mental health when only he reduces work hours. And finally, some policy implications from our study. So our results are aligned with the concerns about the potential impact of pandemic on gender equality and also on single parent families, such as the recent reports from the TUC, from the UN, and also there's a recent report from the Gingerbread. It's calling on the government and also employers to provide extra help and support for single parents and their children at this challenging time. So a care-led economy has recommended by the Women's Budget Group, and we think that with care central to the economy, school and childcare closures would have automatically triggered the discussion of how to support working parents. And we think this care-led economy might have prevented the negative impact of combining work and care during lockdown. Okay, so this is everything. And just to let you know that a preprint of our study is available online, and we also have a blog on this. So we have already shared a link on the chat box. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that was, I think, a really important point to end on, that actually all of the pressures that all of the speakers have talked about, in that combining the paid work and unpaid work, the impact that has on people's mental health is extremely severe. So we're now going to move on to questions. We've had 9 posted in the question box so far. To attendees who maybe came in late, if you can put your question in the Q&A box rather than the chat, because sometimes in the chat they get lost. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the questions in groups of 3 and then ask all of the panel to kind of pick those that are most relevant to their work. So the first 3 questions, so first of all from Laura Hamilton, what was the proportion of women in each class grouping? I think that might be for Claire and Tracey. Amy Carroll, is there any indication from your research about the geographical impact of care on women? Was there any difference between those living in cities compared to more rural locations? I don't know if anybody's looked at that. And from Jane Van Zyl, on Working Families Helpline, we heard from mothers who were asked to furlough when fathers in equivalent roles were not. Our assumption was that this was a bias in the workplace, not only bias within the home. Is this a reasonable assumption? And actually this links to a question from Sue Himmelweit, which is the next question after that, which is that gender norms may also affect employers' behaviour too. So just because controlling for industry and occupation shows the same pattern doesn't mean that different gender effects come from households. It could be that employers across industries discriminate against their female employees, see men keeping their job as more important, or in the case that Jane highlighted, maybe are more likely to encourage female staff to furlough, maybe because they're worried that if they're working from home, they won't be able to focus on their work, because the assumption is that they'll be the one with primary responsibility for childcare. So I will go around the panel and ask for responses to that, starting with Tracey and Claire. Don't feel you've got to answer everything, because there's quite a lot in there. So Tracey, do you want to go briefly first and then Claire?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the top one from Laura. Hi, Laura. Yeah, sorry, we were just skimming through the stuff, but we have got details of our sample in our sort of documents and stuff. So we were focusing particularly on working class women, and in the sample, I think it was about 1/3 of the sample, so about 30% are in those kind of routine and semi-routine occupations. You've got a kind of a similar proportion at the other end, so it's kind of, you know, quite polarized, and not so many women in self-employed you'd expect. So it's under 10% of those women. So when it's kind of the self-employed women, the own account workers kind of jump out a lot, don't they, Claire? But we're kind of always quite wary because they are such a small proportion. So we have got a big chunk of working class women there, if that answers your question, Laura. Claire, do you want to go on?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can talk about the rural urban question, but I was going to just comment briefly on that last one about mothers being asked to furlough. I haven't got an answer for it. It's just, you know, I think it's to do also with the flexibility question, that women, it's seen as a sort of women's issue, and as long as flexible working is seen as a women's issue, it's always going to be the woman who's asked. You know, I think until men take on more flexible working, accept flexible working, and employers embrace flexible working across the board, it's always going to be seen as something that women do. And it's a big issue around the work-life balance question as well. So, and also the fact that women are more likely to work part-time. Perhaps employers have that kind of in their head that the job is less important than the male breadwinner job. So it's that kind of old, you know, standard kind of, you know, it's not explicit, but it is a kind of discriminatory practice by employers that is still going on even now. don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, Tracey, or anybody else.
No, well, I agree
Thanks,
with Susan's points, yeah.
Alison, do you want to respond to those points specifically about furlough and whether it's about employers' attitudes?
Yeah, so yeah, I totally agree, and I'd like to lead a little bit on this because to try and get it down to 10 minutes. But yeah, no, that's totally right. Like controlling for industry and occupation, it could still be coming from discrimination in the workplace or different assumptions about who might want to take up furlough. What we see is there's no difference for us in the proportion of mothers and fathers who are definitely asked to furlough by their employer. The difference is coming from parents who reported having some choice in the matter. We don't know how strongly their employer leaned on them. And also, you know, like who even asks, like the male employees may not even know that furlough is an option because their employer never even reaches out to them, but they may reach out to female employees, kind of coming at that with all the assumptions of motherhood. Yeah, so we can't really disentangle what's going on there. On geographic inequality, we don't collect very granular data, but we saw that in the London region, parents of both genders are far more likely to be able to work from home, and far more are working from home compared to the rest of the country, but we don't have a kind of precise urban-rural split.
Thank you, Alison. Anne and Baowen, I don't know if you have any answers to those questions. I mean, those seem to be more for Alison and Tracey and Claire, but if there's anything in particular around whether did you look at geographical splits at all in your research? No.
No, we didn't, and that's an interesting question, but it's possible, so we can go and do that, so thank you. And just a little thing to add, I agree with what everyone said about the possible gender bias coming from the employer side, and there is a pretty big literature evidence showing flexibility stigma in male-dominated industries, so you can imagine that might feed through into other industries as well.
Thank you. Baowen, is there anything you wanted to add at this point?
Nothing from me.
Okay, okay. So the next three questions, and I'll go to you, Anna Baowen, first on these, just so that we could get it to do it in different orders. Juliana Giuliani said, thank you, very interesting. This is specifically to Alison, so maybe you can come to that in a minute. Are you aware of any differences in the participation of fathers working in the public sector? More flexible, thank you. Mariana Masters, Black households have been hit harder financially by the UK's COVID response, according to a new analysis by the Office of National Statistics released today. More than a quarter of people from Black households, Black backgrounds reported finding it difficult to get by financially in April, far higher than those from other ethnicities. I'm sure this is due, as Mary-Ann stated at the beginning, to existing inequalities being exacerbated. Can I ask why ethnic data is so frequently brushed over? It's so disheartening. Policy leaders will in turn not prioritise unless, like this year, there's a Black Lives Matter awakening where people for a brief time jump on bandwagons. And then an anonymous attendee, how have unpaid working hours been quantified? And I'm going to put in another one because we may not have time to reach them all together. I'm wondering whether you know how many of the women who took part had previously had cleaners and nannies. I think that would be a useful data to get a bigger picture. Likewise, about the previous presentation, I wonder how many of those women requested furlough but were not given it by their employer, a recurring issue I'm hearing. Thank you. So Anne and Baowen, do you want to talk about this first?
Sure. So the easy one first, maybe. People were asked how many hours they spent in childcare and housework. So it's simply a self-report per week. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah, it was asked a little bit differently before the COVID data collection. In terms of ethnicity, I think that's a really, really important point. part of the problem with ethnicity is always on quantitative analysis, having data with enough people from ethnic minority groups to look at. So in the data set we use, they do oversample participants from ethnic communities in order to try to address that issue. But even then, actually, you end up into really crude ethnic groupings, you know, just Black, Asian, white or something. So it's not great. Yeah, it's kind of brushes over important differences potentially, but it would be great to get more data from ethnic minority communities so we can study.
And can I add one more thing about this ethnicity? So in our data, we have adjusted for this ethnicity, but we are not able to do like a specific analysis for ethnic minority because the sample size is just too small to allow for any like good quality analysis. But this is something quite important, and we do feel that in the future there's some kind of more ethnic minority focused study on that, so we can explore much more on that.
Thank you, Baowen. Alison.
So on the first one, the public sector, we haven't done that. We haven't split by that specifically. Like it's going to be picked up in the industry and occupation to a larger extent. So it's not what's driving any differences between the mothers and fathers in the analysis I've showed, but we haven't specifically split by that. In terms of like how we quantified working hours, so this was a time use diary for the day before. So we gave respondents a grid and asked them at every point of the day, what were they doing? They could tick more than one activity. And what's also kind of nice, I think, for the first lockdown is we also chose one of their children at random, asked what their child was doing, and asked who was supervising their child at every point in time. So that is that allowed us to kind of cross-check the childcare to be able to tell if the mother was sitting there trying to do work, but the kid was actually in the same room as them, which so like that kind of passive childcare turned out to be really important for the split between interrupted and uninterrupted work time. I'm just looking at this last question on, yeah, so I mean, the wealthier households were more likely to have cleaners and nannies before. I can't remember the proportion off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that is probably like a bigger change for those households in some respects.
Did you look at ethnicity at all within your sample?
We really face the same problem. Like we have, because by the time we restrict to heterosexual couples, we're down to 3,500, and so we re-weight by ethnicity, but unfortunately it's just too small to kind of try and do a heterogeneity analysis.
Okay. Tracey and Claire. Don't know who.
Just briefly on the BAME data question, I think this is an ongoing issue, and you know, I haven't got anything to say. I just would sort of add my voice to say that that is something that we need more of, and again, we couldn't look at it because of numbers. I was looking down at the question on the cleaners and nannies, and I think the Understanding Society is it has done by somebody else, isn't it? Doesn't specify, unless I'm wrong, if there is a question on cleaners or nannies, but it will ask about is your cleaning or is your housework or childcare done by somebody else? So it is something we can look at. Tracey, did we?
I was just going to go down the other. I'll come back to yours, Claire. So, Mariana, when you were typing, I was kind of nodding away, and you know, the thing about the Black households, because Claire and I did look at analysis by ethnicity, and as everybody said, the numbers kind of fall away too quickly, especially because we want to do an intersection analysis, you know, of class and gender and so on. What we'll be able to do better. So the COVID study is a smaller study of the Understanding Society, and Understanding Society, the annual waves gives us 4 more opportunities, and Claire and I have been really working on looking to do some I think analysis, looking at those kind of real inequalities that you pointed, Mariana. So not yet, but you know, watch this space kind of thing. Hopefully we'll be able to do more, because there's a real emphasis within that survey to look at inequalities into sampling, you know, like other participants had said. I think I love the question that, I mean, I love all the questions, but I love the question about the childcare and the nannies, because it's just perfect. We have got some of the data, like Claire said, but it's just perfect for, you know, certainly for intersection analysis, because you've got your working class women, you've got kind of black women, you've got young women working in the kind of nanny and then childcare, and actually in the homes of, you know, more privileged women. So I think it'd just be great to have more information there, because it just tells you so much, and it's like, you know, literally in the home, and, you know, really sort of talks well to me. My mum was a cleaner, and, you know, kind of just, I think it's a really interesting topic, but we haven't looked at that just as yet. So I hope somebody out there has got more data than we have. Skimming down.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we've got a lot more questions we're not going to be able to get through, and I'm really sorry for the people who asked them, because it's just a limited amount of time. I wanted to give the panel a chance to make any kind of final closing remarks before I ended the webinar at 1 o'clock. So I will start with Alison, because you've been stuck in the middle on all of these, so you always if you'd like to say any kind of final remarks or pick up on anything that other people have said.
I guess I'd close with I think the big topics going forward, kind of in this area. So we've got one set of research sort of looking at the inequalities that have emerged, and then there's another set on what the long-term effect of this is going to be in terms of changing the ways that employers relate to employees and families relate to each other. And I think that's kind of huge, and we don't know much yet. And the two big things, I think, are the long run effects of men increasing childcare and employers getting more used to male employees doing more childcare, and then the long run effects of home working becoming more of the norm in a kind of less of a crisis time, to what extent that is useful for women and to what extent it could actually backfire.
Thank you. Baowen.
So perhaps I'd like to raise the point about single mothers. So juggling work and the family, it's already quite difficult even before the pandemic. And this pandemic makes things much, much harder for the single mothers and also their children. So more focus, more support should be given to single mothers and their children.
Thank you. Anne.
So I see there's a question in the chat about what public health can do to offset inequality for women. Given that's my field, I'll pick up on that. And I think we've become good at recognizing that aspects of work are important for health, but we're still defining work way too narrowly on paid employment. And we need to recognize that work includes all the unpaid care work that goes on outside of paid employment, and that is also important for health, public health.
Thank you. Claire.
I mean, not surprisingly, I would say, you know, as we're focusing on class, I think it is something that we should really look at. And, you know, the idea of working from home, which has been talked about a lot, not everyone can work from home, and that does vary by class. But I would just say that some flexibility is possible in a lot of jobs, which is not really covered at the moment and not really considered important. So
thank you. Tracey, you're on mute.
Classic. Just end by, a bit of a plug to our project. We're really lucky to be funded to carry on looking at our data over the next couple of months, and it's brilliant to be involved with Women's Budget Group and working with them around the care economy. So yeah, we'll carry on doing our stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to flag up a few things that the Women's Budget Group's got coming up. So our next winter webinar is going to be on the 25th of January, and that's with Fran Bennett and Marilyn Howard, and it's looking at how income is shared within households and financial decision making within households. So that's going to be really interesting. We have polling data. We are doing polling with the Fawcett Society and with partners in the devolved nations, Engender and Close the Gap in Scotland, When Wales, and the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. We've got one question coming out this week, which is about Christmas, but the rest of it's coming out in the new year. And that we have booster samples so that we've got a sufficient sample size to look at BME women within that. And also we have a briefing which Anna Johnston, who's organised this webinar, is producing, which is on what we currently know about how COVID has impacted women. So all the findings, it's just pulling together lots and lots of different research. So everything that's been talked about today will be included within that, plus a load of other data, so that there's a kind of we did some work at the beginning of the pandemic saying what we thought was likely to happen, and we know an awful lot more now about what has actually happened, and that will be coming up in the new year. So thank you all very much for attending this event. Thank you very much to our panelists. It's been absolutely brilliant to hear from you, really, really powerful. And if you want to find out more about our work, you can have a look at the Women's Budget Group website, wbg.org.uk, or follow us on Twitter. Thank you. Bye-bye.